let's see, one of your chapters is the Mike Posner song, I Took a Pill in Ibiza, which
Yeah,
is very comical. Again, back to the human part of your book. I just
yeah,
really, it
yeah.
really, you were never short on unique experiences, and you kind of tell a lot of stories about, your experiences, or, you're kind of like, haha, look how silly I was at that age,
Yeah.
or what I knew. You told the story of your first big bonus check. Can you tell us what you did with that first big bonus check? Because we've all had that first big check where you actually feel like you did something.
Well, actually, it's the opposite. It was more like not. I mean, it was $190,000. I get quite
Okay.
specific about that, which was kind of,
You remember it.
Well, of course, how can I forget it? It was more money than like kind of 10 generations of Samas had made in India, right? I mean,
Yeah.
those numbers are insane, man. I mean, and I remember going out and buying my wife a bracelet from Bulgaria, and I bought myself, Saks Fifth Avenue, which was we were in the Rockefeller Center. This is the original Saks Fifth Avenue on Fifth Avenue,
Yep.
and they had a 5 for 1 shades on custom special sorry, you get six for the price of five.
Okay.
So so buy five get one free promotion, and I kind of bought myself kind of these six custom made two-tone, kind of, I'm sure I look ridiculous,
Yeah.
inspired by Michael Douglas in Wall Street. So that's what I did with my first bonus check.
But by the way, and I think you commented on the Bulgari bracelet. I think you made a comment like, "Did your wife ever wear it, or
No,
did
she
you just?"
never wore it. She thought it was silly. I mean, I would buy her these trinkets and she never wore them.
Your wife
I
reminds
think,
me a lot of mine, by the way. When I read that, I was like, "Gosh, that's his wife's like mine. I could do something." She'd be like, "Nah, it's just not my style. Sorry."
well, yeah, it was more like, I mean, I'd prefer it if you did the dishes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah.
so funny. So let's see. So you mentioned this kind of briefly, but Nikesh brought you in to SoftBank. You did some initial consulting for him, and then he wanted to bring you in as an employee and kind of a senior person to their team. Teach us what it was like to get to know Ron Fisher, who is really kind of Moss's number two.
Yeah, Masa was vice chairman, and he was, kind of on the face of it, really easygoing, laid back, but an absolutely brilliant man. And he was, after Nikesh, the first senior person I met at SoftBank, and I really, really liked him too. So a combination of meeting with Ron Fisher, very personable, someone I'd want to hang out with, and he was older. He was almost 70, but I used the line in that book, and I really searched for the right line to describe how I felt about him. I
Mm-hmm.
think the line I used is he was one of those people, if you were around him, it made you less afraid of aging. And that's the best way I can describe how he made me feel. Because he was just a happy, positive person and really brilliant, hardworking, and it was cool to work with him. And then, of course, I met Masa, who was inspiring in a very different way.
Sure.
And a combination of meeting those two individuals is a lot of what drew me to SoftBank.
Sure. You had a phrase you used in describing one of Masa's early strategies. You called it his time machine management strategy.
Yeah.
Can you explain what you mean by that? Because when I think of early SoftBank or early Masa, I think of this as being like kind of his easy arb in a way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting way to describe it, and I think it's accurate. So what I was referring to is it was a key component of his strategy, which is when he looked at emerging markets, and India is a great example, China is another example. The idea of a time machine was simply taking business models, technology business models that have worked in the Western world and transplanting them into emerging markets like India. And you'd always need to tweak those models for local conditions, but it was literally as simple as that. And allied to the notion of a time machine was the idea of leapfrogging. And what do I mean by leapfrogging? Well, take e-commerce for example. In the United States, you've got an embedded mall culture, right? I mean, that's what people like to go to. Wean them away from that into shopping,
Sure.
on digital shopping to shopping online is a shift. Whereas in India, you really don't have organized retail at all. So these technology mega trend, there's no kind of switch change in behavior pattern involved.
Mm-hmm.
As economic prosperity steps in, middle class has greater propensity to spend, you naturally gravitate towards spending online, right? So as a result, e-commerce spending is a proportion of total retail is a much, much higher proportion in India and China, even now, than it is in the United States. So a combination of time machine, taking business models that work in the US, transplanting them, and then those models take off even more powerfully than they do in the US, leapfrogging, because there's less impediments, there's less of a behavioral change at the consumer level that's required for those business models to take hold. So that's a lot
Sure.
of what drove his bet on Alibaba, for example. I mean, he ended up making $73 billion realized profit on Alibaba,
Hmm.
and a lot of what drove his bets on emerging markets like India.
This is the part of the book that you were talking about your first time going to see Masa in Tokyo. You reference one of the most stereotypical movies of experiencing Tokyo, which is obviously the movie Lost in
Lost in
Translation.
translation. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
starring Bill Murray and Scarlett Johansson, a young
Yeah,
Scarlett Johansson and an
yeah.
ugly Bill Murray as usual. Um, but
Yeah,
but so here's it's funny. So I had just gone to Tokyo for the first time from a business perspective. You had obviously been there as a banker,
yeah,
numerous times. Um, I'm a big baseball fan, and we'll get into the baseball conversation
yeah,
later because
yeah, yeah.
I love that story too. But I land there first time there. I can't remember where I was staying. I was staying at some nice hotel, really central there in Tokyo, and obviously the Yomiuri Giants are playing that afternoon on Sunday, and so I thought, oh, maybe I'll go up to the game. I don't end up going to it, but obviously the baseball culture is very big there, and some people think, oh, that's very American. But at the same time, the Nippon Baseball League, I think you can have a max of like 2 or 3 foreigners on the baseball team.
Yeah.
Can you speak to the homogenous nature that you experience as a business person? And also, you were a very senior person at SoftBank, and yet it seems that you walk away with that too, much like everybody else has.
Well, my early visits to Tokyo were short business trips, initially from New York,
Okay.
and then from Hong Kong, and that was your classic, kind of the Bill Murray captured it wonderfully, right? I mean, through that haze of jet lag, you're kind of in
Yeah.
this complete alien land, and the disorientation is, I hated it, to be quite honest. And then I
Okay.
go in, and actually, even before I joined SoftBank, we did a 2-week family or 1-week family holiday, and it happened to be cherry blossom season, and I absolutely loved it. Right,
Okay.
so all that negativity was a function of kind of in and out, never really experiencing the culture, et cetera, et cetera. And then, when you're looking at Tokyo, when you're going to restaurants, and I describe how I walked through Ginza, and we walked into this store, sort of the equivalent of Tiffany's in Ginza, which is the main shopping area in
Yeah.
Tokyo. And when you're with Masayoshi Son, it was I don't know if there's a parallel, right? I mean, it's kind of, maybe it's a little bit like walking with Donald Trump into Tiffany's, but
Yeah.
let's face it, Masa Son is a lot more popular than Donald Trump might be in New
Yeah.
York and elsewhere. He's polarizing, and Masa was just universally popular, and
Yeah.
to go in with the richest and one of the most popular. By the way, in terms of measuring popularity, Masa at the time had more Twitter followers back when Twitter X was known as Twitter. He had
Yeah.
more Twitter followers than the Prime Minister of Japan, right? So
Yeah.
you're going in where with someone who's the richest man in the country, a bit of a cult figure. That was seriously, seriously cool. I mean, if he went out for dinner, the restaurant would help you out.
If he'd say like, "Oh, why don't you get your wife something?" And it's almost like the king is saying, "You should do this." And you're like,
Yeah,
"Well,
absolutely. Yeah,
who am I
yeah.
to say no?"
Yeah, and the irony of, like, richest man, if not the richest, certainly the second, certainly the one of the richest people in the world. Doesn't matter, kind of, it's a
Yeah.
rounding error after 10 billion. Who's counting? The irony of the store manager telling me that because you've come in with Son, we're going to give you a discount. I thought that was kind of cute too.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Let's see. So when you're talking about Masa as an idealist, the other thing that you talked about in your book and he talks about is the idea of being crazy. And people think of that as like a negative thing. And Masa, there's a craze in a way that Masa looks at as a brilliant and really kind of driven phenomena. Can you explain the idea of crazy to Masa?
Yeah. So there's two elements to crazy. One is plain and simple, kind of the idea of living in the future, right? If you're living in the future, back in 2014, I talk about this. He would
Hmm.
talk about singularity, and he would talk about empathetic robots and the Internet of Things. In his mind, as we sit here today with self-driving cars and AI and Chat
Yeah.
GPT, etc., it's a reality. But this is 2014. In his mind, this was a done deal. He was living in that future, right? And when you're living in that future and you're talking about, kind of robots with emotional engines and agentic AI, he was talking about all of those things. And when you do that, people are going to think you're a little bit crazy. When you
Yeah.
talk about, we start making giant bets kind of based on convictions like that. But there's a second element of that, which is almost kind of Machiavellian, which is really clever, which is, and there's elements of Donald Trump there, which is very interesting, which
Yeah.
is let the world think you're crazy. And when you come along, you're this crazy guy with this big checkbook, nobody messes with you.
Yeah.
Right. So I gave the example where the first deals I did was a Uber competitor in India. And back then there were two local competitors to India. When Son got behind one of them, in this case it was Ola Cabs, the second one folded because who's going to mess with this crazy guy? Right. So I think letting people believe that you're not just powerful in the sense that you've got this capital cannon behind you, but that you're a little bit crazy, that you might act a little bit irrationally. Nobody wants to mess with you. And in a business context, sometimes that could be a real competitive weapon.
Well, I think you mentioned, because you were looking at it as like, why would someone want a negative revenue business? But to your point, it was more about the strategy in that case than it was about the business per
Well, you
se.
can't really. I mean, I had a fairly conventional upbringing in as much as, Wharton MBA, so
Yeah.
schooled in conventional finance,
Yeah.
discounted cash flows, Wall Street, same thing, kind of building big LBO models,
Hmm.
valuation models, looking at comps. You kind of need to throw a lot of that out the window when it comes to technology investing. Right,
Sure.
because I kind of did the numbers on you did the early days, you did the numbers on Uber, and you could quickly conclude, I mean, I did, that these businesses were worthless. I mean, they were just bleeding money, right? And but then I had this conversation with Masa, and his perspective was, look, I mean, you got to look out 10 years in the future because you're really buying into a platform. And take ride hailing, for example. Imagine a world with autonomous cars. We're here now, by the way.
Yeah.
But again, these conversations were 10 years ago. Imagine a world with autonomous cars where kind of what's the biggest single leakage in the Uber business model? Well, when you and I, any of your listeners, when you take an Uber, you spend, say, $10, $7 goes to the driver. Well, in an
Yeah.
autonomous cars, there is no driver, right? Now,
Yeah.
you can't even begin to model that because who's going to own these autonomous cars? What are the economics of that? And you very quickly realize that, forget it, forget the numbers. This is a bet on a future which is going to be very different, and on an entrepreneur who I think will execute and will position the company so that it becomes center of that futuristic ecosystem.
Sure.
And that's what those bets were all about.
Yeah, it's funny. We have obviously we have driverless cars all around the valley here. With Waymo, and
Yeah.
so to your point, I always tell people. And here's the weird thing: I think a lot of people get caught up and say like the electric engine versus combustion debate on cars. I think that's a waste of time. To your
Yeah.
point, it's the technology of ease and convenience and freedom is what I'd call it. And I mean, in full disclosure, I send my daughters that do not yet drive to the mall in a Waymo
Yeah.
because why not? Like, I'm a very expensive taxi driver in effect. And to your point, that was something that wasn't possible. Let me ask you this. So you talk about the idea of blitz scaling. And again, you pepper really good kind of, I'll call it technology strategy ideas or financing ideas throughout your book. In blitz scaling, is part of the reason why we never saw blitz scaling on some of these levels do you think it has anything to do with the cheaper cost of money, or in effect, you're only as good as your last ability to raise capital in some cases, as we've seen through history? Do you think that the ability to raise capital is a dominant feature of blitz scaling?
It absolutely is, but let's be careful about choice of words. Reid Hoffman, kind of celebrated venture capitalist behind
Sure.
LinkedIn, many other companies. He's the one who introduced that term into the vernacular, and blitzscaling works wonderfully in the context of platform business models, right?
Okay.
Where you have I'm sure most people are familiar with the idea of network effects, which is
Hmm.
the more people get on a platform, the more valuable it becomes, right? I mean, early days, your reason to get on Facebook was, well, everyone was getting on Facebook. And as more and more people get on, you got to be there too. And that becomes a reason for people to advertise on Facebook, and more people get on, et cetera, et cetera. Kind of
Sure.
that's the flywheel. Same thing with Amazon or Google or Uber for that matter. Uber, another great example, which is kind of more people get on, that attracts drivers. If there are more drivers, and wait times go down, and more people get on, and so on and so forth. So
Yep.
I think there is a winner take all aspect to these platform business models, and blitzscaling is the only way to go. Now, blitzscaling works less well for capital intensive business models, right?
Okay.
So, we in my book, we talk about the counterexample, which is WeWork, which did not work out very well, because
Yeah.
WeWork is not only is it not a it certainly isn't a platform business model. It's not even a technology business model, because the economics are local, right? They're hyper local. I mean, if you're in a place like New York City, the economics of literally, varies by block. Even within the block varies by building, right? I mean, there's so many factors that come into play.
Yeah.
So blitzscaling is not a good idea. You got to be really, really efficient about how you deploy capital, and that's one of the many things you learn along the way when you're in the world of technology. So but coming back to the point you made, capital is, you look at what's going on with AI now, and how quickly people are scaling, and certainly for someone like an OpenAI, the need to invest, even overinvest in processing capacity, and again, virtuous circle. The more you're investing in capacity, the more people on the network, your models get better, etc. Again, same flywheel, right? But in
Sure.
this case, it's really capital intensive. So even in that case, capital is a competitive advantage. It's absolutely crucial. And that I would argue even more than a lot of the other business models.